Good morning and welcome to this Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we've got a man against being, body horror and the death of life. So we're discussing that new book by Aurora Linnea, and we're joined by Aurora and Renate Klein and Susan Hawthorne from Spin Effects Publishers. So we're running these webinars because as radical feminists, our voices have been cancelled from universities and schools. So frustrated that we can't share our voices in these places, we've created this series of webinars. So I hope that you enjoy it, and I'll hand over to Renate, who's going to start.
Before we start, I want to say that I consider Man Against Being one of the most profound books I have ever read. Aurora has pulled together an amazing amount of information about what generic man, patriarchal man, does to bodies, not just women's bodies, but his own body and the body of all other living organisms on Earth, from animals to plants. Aurora does not shrink back from providing us with often gruesome graphic details of what this actually entails, but she does this with the most beautiful poetic language. This is what makes this book, subtitled Body Horror and the Death of Life, bearable to read, and importantly, also because Aurora infuses her descriptions and analysis with a lot of irony and wit, so we can smile and even laugh sometimes despite the grim text before us. If you like the raw power and beauty of Andrea Dworkin and Susan Griffin's writing, this book is for you. Now, because Aurora's book is so full with meticulously researched details, it is a real challenge to present Man Against Being to you in less than an hour. Can I just say already now that to fully appreciate her work, you really need to read this book yourself. And if you plan to go to a desert island over Christmas, that's the book to take. Even if you get stranded, you will be able to draw on it for a lifetime. So let me begin by introducing Aurora. Aurora Linnea is a radical eco-feminist writer committed to poetic dissidence and uncompromising disloyalty to male dominion. She has authors poetry chapbooks, horror stories, and zines, and contributes regularly to the media disruption of women's liberation radio news. And if you don't know about that, you should go and watch their website. They publish fabulous stuff. In the past, she has served women as a shelter worker and rape crisis advocate. And Aurora says she no longer is in collusion with the predator. And now on to the introduction to MAP, as we have called it. I want to start with Aurora's first very powerful sentence in her book. She writes, and I quote, "In the urgency of my heartbreak as a ravaged world succumbs to plunder and the killing won't slow but only accelerates with the unstoppable surge of years, I write because I want to scream it. Men hate life. By life, I mean the substance of creation, the creatures that men themselves are, their existence as body, and the matter from which their bodies are made. Life is being alive on the earth, being an animal, being a body. Life means being." And a bit further down, she adds, "It is an oversight to shrink from what is clear to see. So we observe that men have spent thousands of years articulating their hatred of life and acting on it. Men have made themselves clear. Why not take them at their word?" And indeed. So Aurora, can you please tell us a bit what made you write MAP and what the main message is in your book and what you like readers to take from your book?
Sure. I'm not on mute. Okay, good. First, I really just want to thank Renate and Susan for taking on this book and for the many hours of work that they, along with the other amazing women at Spin Effects, put into bringing it into being. Renate's praise is really overwhelming for me. But the fact is that without spin effects, books like mine wouldn't have any place. They would not be published. So I can't overstate how much I appreciate this press and these women for keeping radical feminist publishing alive. To answer the question, I've been thinking about this book for a long time. Since I was very young, I've been agonized by the violence of what I used to call human civilization and would today call man-made civilization. The harm that's done to animals, to women, to forests and oceans, the endemic poverty and exploitation, endless war. Is the volume better? Okay, all right. It was unbearable for me. I couldn't understand what was going on or how these things could happen. I read a great deal trying to figure it out, but was consistently met with dead-end assertions of power for power's sake as the answer. So eventually my question became, what's the point of power? Why are the men who rule the world so desperate to control everything and so vicious when they fail to? It was these questions that resulted in eventually in the analysis that I've sketched out in Man Against Being. What I would hope for readers to take away from the book is an understanding that the diverse atrocities of man-made civilization, from male violence against women to nuclear weapons to ecocide, are symptoms of the same basic derangement. Men have posed themselves in opposition to material reality. For thousands of years, the founding fathers of our societies have been opposed to life on Earth, antagonistic to their nature as biological organisms. Man-made civilization as we know it is molded around this opposition, and since nothing healthy can grow from the rejection of life, we've got this sick society that we're suffering within now. I wrote the book as my contribution to clarifying the ideological premises of patriarchal violence, because if the underlying pathology isn't rooted out, no remedy is ultimately possible. The sickness simply will reappear in new forms.
Thank you very much, Aurora. That's very powerfully expressed. And thank you also for your thanks for to us at Spinifex. It's true. A lot of our books would probably not be published somewhere else, but that's what we want to publish really strong books like yours. So thank you. And it was a pleasure working with you. We all had fun despite the difficult nature of the book. So Aurora finishes the introduction with this powerful passage. And I really could quote the whole book because it's so good. I'm committed to telling the truth about its atrocities, not to wallow in the abyss of the status quo, despairing, but to confront it as honestly as I can without shrinking back in fear or sorrow. Because to fail to confront reality honestly is to forfeit finding any real answers at all. Andrea Dworkin wrote that to be a writer, quote, means telling the truth. It means being incorruptible. It means not being afraid and never lying. End of quote. What I asked you to understand is that my purpose on the pages ahead is not to dwell on horrors, but to do my part to get us out of the hole. I do love life. I have no other reason to write. Powerful words. Over to Susan for chapter 1, body horror.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So the first two words that Aurora writes in chapter 1 are the blob. The Blob is one of the few horror movies that I've seen. Part of the horror of The Blob is that it is obscenely organic. Each time the blob consumes a living thing, it gets larger. It grows and is out of control. But what really horrifies audiences is its slimy, tumorous nature. It is, of course, a film made by men and expresses men's horror at the nature of nature, the nature of the organic life, life that is born, life that dies, and when it dies exudes yet more horror because it is, after all, an organic substance. In many ways, this is a symbol of the patriarchal imagination, what Aurora calls somatophobic foundations, body hating, body fear, which she goes on to elucidate as central to the history of Christianity as well as postmodernism. She cites Julia Kristeva, who writes, "The body must bear no trace of its debt to nature. It must be clean and proper in order to be fully symbolic." That's from her book, The Powers of Horror. Aurora, can you say a little more about this notion of body horror and the role it plays in your analysis?
Body horror is a term that I lifted from the horror genre. It's used to describe films and literature that revolve around how a person's own body can terrify and terrorize them. One's own body is the monster in these sorts of stories rather than some outside attacker. Mutation and mutilation are regular themes, along with bodies that don't function the way that they should, bodies that turn against people by going awry in all manner of gross and gory ways, by being vulnerable to injury, and ultimately by dying. What these films depict in the most exaggerated fashion, I have come to see as the standard relation to being a body within patriarchal culture, which is to say, the body is imagined and then experienced as separate from oneself as a person, not only separate, but as a menace, a dangerous entity to be controlled and defeated. Some degree of fear, hatred, and disgust for biological bodies is endemic across man-made cultures, as I try to show in the book. And so too are desperate efforts to contain the threat that bodies pose. Body horror is central to my thesis that because man is terrified of being a body, he despises nature for dooming him to mortal materiality and lashes out in vengeance. And the other relevant manifestation of body horror is men's denial of their own bodiliness and the resultant projection of that bodyhood onto others, which I understand as being really central to all forms of oppression.
Thank you. In the following pages, Aurora writes of man's revulsion of, quote, raw, wet flesh, suggesting that man feels powerless against out-of-control growth, including such disparate things as winds, vines, viruses, and unfettered growth. Against unfettered growth, man's sense of the power of his body is overruled. His solution is to hermetically seal the body so it becomes impenetrable. To be permeable and penetrable is far too close to woman. Woman, by contrast, is demonic and must be exorcised. The worst thing of all is that the body dies. The dead body, in some traditions, Theravada Buddhism, is made an object of contemplation, watching as the body disintegrates. The contemporary version of this is the zombie movie and the idea of the undead. Aurora argues that from Plato until now, that release from the fleshy body, a rejection of bodily existence, enables something better after death. Man is not mere matter, but rather has a soul, immaterial and pure. Reading this not long after reading Soma Brodrick's Nothing Matters, I'm struck by Soma and Aurora's shared insights about the male philosophical tradition, and indeed by the movement away from the body, which is inherent in the trans ideology, space exploration, and in ideas infecting the AI industry. Escape is man's fantasy from his body, from earth, and from the life force. Chapter 2 is called Severed Heads Forever, Disembodiment and Immortal Manhood. And over to you, Renate.
Thank you, Susan. Aurora starts this chapter with an extremely witty description of René Descartes. the man who gave us the Cartesian dualism, meaning we are split into mind and matter. Except for Descartes, mind is clearly so much more important than matter. In fact, as Aurora writes, next it occurs to Descartes that he is not a body. And he concludes with total confidence that, I quote, the concept of the body includes nothing at all which belongs to the mind, and the concept of mind includes nothing at all which belongs to the body. Topping it off with, quote, man is he who thinks himself into existence. And if he thinks it, it must be so. Man thinks he is immortal, therefore he never dies. Alas, eternal life is not to be. For Descartes, as Aurora writes with wonderful sarcasm, quote, it was a cold winter in Sweden in February of 1650 when Descartes, aged 54, contracted pneumonia. He would be dead within the months. I love that bit about Descartes. It's so well written. After Descartes, we get into Death and Denial, with Aurora quoting Ernest Becker's work, for which he got the Pulitzer Prize, awarded posthumously, as Aurora sarcastically observes, and she comments that, quote, for Becker, it is terror that maketh the man, and terror that ruleth the man-made world. Man's is a kingdom of fear. Isn't that true? Now, from Becker, we move on to immortality, culture, and religion. Do you want to elaborate on this, Aurora, please?
At some point, I thought I was quite clever for realizing that all the major religions that I could think of were organized around convincing adherents that by following the religion, they could escape death. And then I read an article in an anthology about religion and death, in which the author called it, quote, uncontroversial and unoriginal to observe that religions emerge from the aspiration to avoid death. And I felt less clever, but happy to have my suspicions confirmed by a scholar. Religion's function as an antidote to death is evidenced by the concepts of immortal gods, of afterlives and underworlds, of reincarnation and resurrection. And indeed, the metaphysical conceit of the soul itself is derived from antibody thinking, given that it sets up the soul as something separate from and often trapped, even imprisoned within the material body. Many people can recognize the death-defying urges of a religion like Christianity, which has as its leading man a guy who reanimates corpses and returns from the dead, and whose claim to his disciples is that whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. It's somewhat less obvious with Buddhism, for example, which is often embraced in progressive circles as being a counterpoint to the Abrahamic religions. But for the Buddhist, nirvana is achieved when the soul is released entirely from the cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth, and is relieved from existing altogether. Upon closer review, all of these religions reveal themselves as institutions, and they are patriarchal institutions, which impose social control by extracting conformity through the promise of loopholes out of mortality.
Thanks, Aurora. And I'm really glad you got Buddhism in there as well, because some people think, oh, Buddhism is different. It's really good. Well, it's actually not. The next section in this chapter takes us to Reborn, the Man of Steel, where Aurora looks into Klaus Tewelite's writings. Now, Tewelite is a famous German sociologist who wrote important books about manhood and Nazi ideology. And Aurora, here you introduced the concept of man, the mastermind, which eventually leads us to the Terminator. Any comments?
The idea of man as mastermind is really important to the rest of the book from this point forward. The epithet I came up with to emphasize how man affiliates himself with his mind and not his body, and then imagines that as the mind, it's within his power to master matter. This is mind over matter in the most literal fashion, and comes into play when I look later at how men assuage the anxieties caused by body horror through projecting bodiliness onto members of subjugated classes and then mastering or dominating them. But here, I'm talking about men's obsessive passion for machines, which I see as based in a yearning to create new non-biological vehicles for the minds that they believe themselves to be. I write, quote, because the mortal material body he is humiliates him, what man desires, what man says he deserves, is a new body, one worthy of his mind and his manhood, a body that is indestructible, dependable, amenable to discipline, a body to serve and glorify the mastermind. Programmed to obey the mind, the machine body runs smoothly and never stalls, as long as man maintains it in good working order. The machine fetishism and technophilia, characteristic of patriarchal industrial civilization, represents men's longing to make themselves over out of hard metal. This is why Superman is the Man of Steel, and why movies like RoboCop and Transformers are big hits. It's why a character like the Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger's expressionless, indestructible cyborg assassin, was so popular that even though he is the villain in the first Terminator film, in the sequel, he's rehabilitated to be the leading man. It's a cultural ideal for men.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Now, the chapter ends with some very choice women-hating comments, which I'll read. So this is a quote. The man to be cut is cut off from the mother, because mothers are the wellspring of male mortality. By creating him in her womb from the bad matter of her own being, the mother consigns man to the death sentence of bodiliness. And this is to say nothing of the general grossness of birth and begetting, condemned by the Greek philosopher Parmenides as, quote, hateful and vile, 50s qualified with secretions and spasms. Such animalistic wallowing debases everyone involved. Unable to stomach it, man maneuvers to annul his fatal, filthy female provenance through ritualized rebirth, mid-husbanded by designated clean and proper father figures. Motherless, he would resurrect himself, father born. All right, now we move to chapter 3, others / bodies. Susan.
Okay, so Aurora begins this chapter by pointing out man's disengagement between body and mind. The mind is man's true self. The body is a burdensome object, and the mind is immaterial and hence immortal. The result of this is what Aurora calls radical exclusion, echoing Val Plumwood's patriarchal mantra, quote, I am nothing like this inferior other. Such a view is related to the philosophical position of dualism, a fraught philosophy developed out of Descartes' work. Aurora, can you expand on the incongruity between dualist and ecofeminist philosophies?
Descartes' name is the one that's most often linked with dualism. We've got Cartesian dualism as a name for the split, after all. But dualism is actually an ideology with a much longer history within the Western philosophical tradition. It's at the heart of any belief system that posits the existence of a soul or mind or spirit separate from the body. But what Descartes did was popularize it for the modern era, giving it a scientific and secular validity that more explicitly religious forms of dualism lacked. But whether secular or religious, dualism is this delusion that the mind and the body are discrete entities, that the two can be split off from one another cleanly, and also that they are opposites. Likewise, the immaterial is divided from and opposite to the material. Culture is divided from and opposite to nature. The animal is divided from and opposite to the human, man from woman, black from white, and so on. Ecofeminist philosophy, by contrast, dismisses dualism as a rationalization devised by men to support their fantasy that they can endure eternally as immortal, immaterial minds or souls, while at the same time justifying their oppression of the beings that they yoke to the body side of dualism's dividing line: animals, women, racialized groups, members of non-dominant religions. Instead, ecofeminism is grounded not in frantic separation and opposition, but in holism, a recognition of the oneness, interconnection, and interdependency of life on Earth. Human bodiliness and animality is accepted and embraced as the reality that we share with all other creatures who are our kin. Ecofeminism denies the artificial divisions, polarities, and hierarchies that men have sought to enforce.
Thank you for that. Aurora then goes on to talk about the scapegoat. And we all know that that's something that feminists experience regularly. In the book of Leviticus, 2 goats are slaughtered. The first offered to God as penance for transgressions committed during the last year. The second goat is driven away from the settlement into a barren region to die miserably. The goats become the sin that is perpetrated. It is regarded as impure and carries all the bad things. So an animal pays for the sins of man. It is due to the belief that animals are both mindless and soulless. The hatred and diminishment of animals goes alongside the hatred and diminishment of women, because animals and women are bodies. This then ricochets through the culture, resulting in industries such as porn, technologies that disembody and disconnect humans. Mythically speaking, women are associated with monstrous creatures. There are many of those, from Mesopotamia to Greece to the Celtic lands, such as Tiamat, Scylla, Echidna, Medusa. The Morrigan are just some examples. Evil in women is excused for bad behavior by men, and it is women who are blamed and punished for the spread of things like sexually transmitted diseases, when it should be man and his misogynistic acts. Women are blamed, goddesses are blamed, and blacks are blamed too, for slavery and much more. And here's a quote from Aurora: "Like animals, like females, the racialized further hasten civilization's undoing as disease vectors, a dangerous form of living contaminant to be feared not only as destructive, but also as proliferating, invasive, entering into and spreading through man's clean and orderly system, corrupting it. An echo of man's fear of the organic. In some, as Aurora writes, man lines up his scapegoats for the sacrifice. He is self and they are others. Animals, females, the racialized." I'm now passing over to Renate to talk about chapter 4, which is called Mastering the Body by Proxy, Rituals of Corporeal Control and Punishment.
Thanks, Susan. For me, that was the hardest chapter to read, and I grumbled every time we had another edit on it, because of its sometimes very gruesome descriptions. But everything Aurora writes about has happened or is happening, and we cannot just look past the horror that man creates. That's one of the important things about man against being. This chapter has a number of sections and starts with mortifications. In mortification, Aurora details the horrors that mostly Italian saints, all women, go through to purge and cleanse and starve their body, which they have been told by man is evil. We hear what happened to St. Catherine of Genoa, St. Rosa of Lima, St. Mary Magdalene, Santa Teresa of Avila, and others. And I will really leave it to you to read this for yourself. Next, Aurora connects this compulsion to get rid of flesh, the body, to modern anorexia, also really interesting and important. The next section in the chapter is called mutilation. Here, Aurora gives a very good overview of the horrors that happens in cosmetic surgery, with examples from South Korea, and then also discussing the so-called bimbo movement, which is so idiotic. It is really hard to believe women can be that stupid, turning themselves into hyper-feminine sex dolls just because men want it. Aurora then turns to despicable experiments on animals, with creating surplus flesh chicken who are too big to even be able to move around. And then she moves to the oncomouse, a mouse who is genetically engineered to get cancer all throughout her body and die a miserable death. For animal lovers, these sections are hard to read, but this is what man does and we need to know about. Next comes the section on humiliation. Starting with the most dreadful treatments of piglets and hens, Aurora then juxtaposes what man's science, and I would also add its greed, does to animals with what was done to Jewish people in Nazi concentration camps. Needless to say, it is extraordinarily distressing to read these juxtapositions, but they are highly effective. So, Aurora, what made you think of making these comparisons?
I pulled together the material that I did in this section, knowing that some readers would be uncomfortable with the comparisons that I'm making between the treatment of animals in industrial farms, of women in pornography as well feature in this chapter, and of Jewish people and other targeted groups in Nazi concentration camps. To begin with, people tend to be upset by any comparisons to the Holocaust, and I completely understand that. The Holocaust was a singular atrocity, to be sure, but in scale and technologized efficiency, more so than in its basic mode of operations. There is much to be learned about the nature of oppression and cultural sadism from considering the similarities between the victimizations of different types of creatures. We see the same things happen over and over again. It's depersonalization, objectification, scorn and shaming, consumption and discard. Here, I'm writing about the shared method of humiliation. And I got this idea from the specific connection from the late animal liberation activist and philosopher Karen Davis. She writes about what she calls the excremental universe that the oppressor creates for his victims by confining them in such filthy conditions and so depriving them of any means of caring for themselves that their own bodily functions become integral to their brutalization. Because in somatophobic culture, dignity relies on the capacity to conceal bodiliness, the creature in the excremental universe who can conceal nothing is humiliated, loses her dignity, and falls beneath contempt. The point is to make the victims repulsive to witnesses, to the victimizers, and to themselves as well. It's a degradation meant to demoralize the oppressed beyond resistance, and for the oppressors to justify the violence that they perpetrate. You are filth, and it is right that I treat you as such is the thrust here. Industrial farms, the pornographic scene, and Nazi concentration camps stood out to me as really highly visible examples of an excremental universe created by man.
Yeah, you make the point really very well here. The next section is called consumption, which starts with some horrific figures of how many corpses the US produces each year of slaughtered animals. Approximately 34 million cows, 125 million pigs, 2 million sheep and lambs, 60 million turkeys, and 9 billion chickens. These carcasses are then turned into all sorts of products, from bone meal to fish meal, and sold back to us. Again, Aurora next moves to the Nazis, specifically Heinrich Himmler, and how he ordered to extract gold teeth from Jewish people before they were killed, as well as female hair. The ashen bone from their bodies was used as fertilizer, and the fat that ran from the bodies when they were burned was used in turn to fuel the crematoria. Really not very sure what language one can use to comment on this. Again, this moving between what happens to animals and then to women works very well in its awfulness. So, Aurora, do you want to say a bit more here?
Sure. This section I based around the word render, which is a verb with many meanings, but most often in general parlance, it's used to describe the alteration of something into some other state, as in, I was rendered speechless, I was rendered unconscious. In the agricultural context, however, it refers to the process of rendering, by which the remnants of animals slaughtered for human consumption as food are converted by various means into any number of additional commodities. Through rendering, the most is made of slaughtered animals, so that men in these industries can reap maximal profits from the violence that they commit. This method of maximizing the profit potentials of violent action through extreme commodification of the victims reminded me of how, whenever men go to war, one consequence is the prostitution of the women of the war-torn nation. Cynthia Enloe illuminates this phenomenon really well in her book, Bananas, Beaches, and Bases, Making Feminist Sense of International Politics, as does Sheila Jeffreys in The Industrial Vagina, The Political Economy of the Global Sex Trade, both of which books you should absolutely read. Perhaps the paradigmatic example of war and poverty resulting in booming prostitution industries for the pleasure and profit of the male master class is the case of Thailand, which was contracted by the US military as a rest and relaxation site for troops during the Vietnam War, with R&R understood quite explicitly to include sexual access to Thai women. After the war, selective financial aid from international lenders like the World Bank prodded Thailand to solidify prostitution tourism, more often called sex tourism, as its main industry, in part by systematically desolating the peasantry so that young women and girls would be forced into the cities where they could be prostituted. Something similar happened in the Philippines. Immiserated women sold cheap as sexual commodities are a constant reward that men extract from the ruins of war and global capitalism.
Thank you. And this section ends with this stark summarizing sentence. Aurora writes, quote, surrounded by bodies he has rendered useful, which he uses in accordance with his needs and desires, man lives like a king. All the world is his for the feasting. The next section in this very long chapter is called replacement. Because man is fundamentally afraid of the power women have to sexually arouse him, they need to be controlled. An example was stonemason Pygmalion's beautiful statue Galatea, which the goddess Aphrodite then allowed him to turn into a flesh and bone live woman. These days, it is sex dolls that fulfill man's desire to control women. Sex dolls are perfect and they don't talk back. And see also Caitlin Roper's book on sex dolls. From sex dolls, we then move into robots and are told by male robotic experts that, and that's a quote from one, in the near future, sex with machines will be better and more satisfying than sex with humans, since robots can be programmed to, quote, meet each individual's need. And of course, all with the help of AI. But what happens when man wants an heir? At the moment, we still exploit and abuse real women through surrogacy, but man wants that changed. Aurora, do you want to elaborate on the bright, womanless future?
Even grossly exploitative as surrogacy is, to the patriarchal mind, it still affords women too much power because the man still needs the woman to produce a child. No matter how objectified she is, he is dependent on her to reproduce. So she still has some leverage. As in most cases, men would prefer an actual machine of their own making to do the job, something that is more perfectly under male control. Which brings us to ectogenesis, the development of technologies enabling men to grow babies outside of women's bodies and inside what are really creepily called extracorporeal uterine devices. Two of these devices have shown what researchers call promising results, and these are the BioBag and the Eve protocol. I don't have time now to go into the really horrific detail on how these technologies work, but if you are up for some ultra dystopic reading, I recommend the scientific literature here. It's also telling for me that researchers named their upgraded womb Eve. Man reinvents the mythic first woman as a machine, his thing to own and use. And the machine will be a better version than the organic female, to a safer place for man's heirs to gestate. I'll quote myself because Renate said that she liked this sentence, so I'll read it. Quote, and then, nestled in their sterile, carefully surveyed and regulated environment, under perfectly controlled conditions, remote from the body, then the sons of man will develop into a superior quality crop of young stock, inheritors of the kingdom. At which point man will have fashioned himself into his own progenitor, and like Zeus hatching his children straight from the Godhead, he will repopulate the world with the spawn of his endlessly fertile mind.
Isn't that wonderfully expressed? You can just see it, how it happens. And they're really working on this. I mean, the BioBag is touted as a big achievement, and we will, I don't think we will see, or I will see it in my lifetime, but you know, they don't give up. They want this ectogenesis. Next, we move to the section on torture, in which Aurora starts with a tortured body in pain, like when Consuela Rivera Fuentes was tortured as Pinochet's prisoner in Chile, and then she goes on to corrective rape of lesbians in South America, Argentina, and other countries. Then Aurora juxtaposes modern torture with quotes from witch trials, which again works extremely well, because they're all too similar. And Aurora writes, the wounded body, the body in pain, the body that can be destroyed, that thing is the body, it is not man. Sorry, it is not man's self. And so the detainee confesses to the torturer, you are nothing at all like this inferior others. After a couple of totally dreadful experiments on animals, we then get to annihilation. Here, Aurora first talks about multiple rapes of women by men, which all but annihilates the women, but then moves to others that are also man's enemy. And she writes, horribly, the female is not man's only enemy. He also claims self-defense to justify colonization and genocide. Then we first read about the genocide of Native Americans and then move on to the dreadfully disfigured victims after the atom bombs was dropped by US pilots on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan and later during the war in Vietnam. Think Agent Orange. Finally, we get to the end of this very long, tough chapter, and I'd like to read part of the last page for a full impact on what man does to life around him. And I had to shorten this quote about 5 times. It's very good. I could read much more. Rachel Carson keenly observed that man's war against nature is inevitably a war against himself. And of course, she was right. The war man launched so many years ago, which he seems so close in our age to finishing, is a war against the creature he is, in reality, the animal he is, the body. Yet man is too far gone in his age-old delusions to recognize that the massacre he commits is in fact a murder-suicide. Already man is planning for his real and true life, the eternal one that awaits him in the fatherlands of heaven above. Gloriously cut off from reality, without a body, without a world, man begins again. And so we move into chapter 5, Life After Life, Post-Embodiment, Fantasies of the Terminal Man, and I'll continue with this chapter. Aurora starts this chapter with a quote from Susan Griffin, which she wrote in 1989 in a book chapter called Split Culture. It reads, "It is in the nature of the deluded mind to choose to preserve its delusion over its own life." This is so true, it's a brilliant quote and totally explains the trans cult. Now, in this chapter, Aurora charts the development of the delusion that artificial life is possible and death can be avoided. She calls it Genesis 2.0. Quote, "Artificial life is driving life's driving ambition is Genesis 2.0, the coming into being of entirely new, wholly man-made life forms destined to reproduce and adapt their way to dominance over biological creation. The emergence and ascendancy of this genetically engineered, robotic and/or computer-simulated entities is envisaged by the scientists involved as evolution's next great leap forward, the passing of the baton from earthborn to techno-fathered creation." The next section is suitably entitled Our Bodies, Our Avatars. And Aurora writes, quote, "The body is a terrible problem to have, but with a little work, it might yet be salvaged. The body can be customized into a culturally meaningful object, artifact, or in the postmodernist parlance, a text writ in flesh. This bodily redesign is supposed to be especially good and liberative for women," say postmodern feminists. And Aurora writes, quote, "The self uses the body, the self controls the body, the self communicates through the body, but the self never is the body. The two remain forever divided and estranged." This edgy reinvention of dualism, Aurora rightly continues, is, quote, "locked into place now as transgenderism's guiding theory." As she writes, "The salve for the painful incongruence between self and body is techno-medical intervention to retrofit the body into a state of harmony with the individual's gender identity, now synonymous with the true self." It leads to what Silvia Guerini called, quote, a permanent construction site, which is a fabulous description, really fitting. But I will leave you to read Aurora's word on the trans cult by yourself. Instead, we are following our industrial founding fathers of transhumanism to make the leap from Earth to other planets where they believe man's future lies. In the next two sections, the self-made man / machine, and other words are preferable, we learn what Martin Rothblatt, a man, Ray Kurzweil, as well as Elon Musk with SpaceX, and Jeff Bezos with his aerospace firm Blue Origin are planning for us. You do need to read it for yourself, how these men imagine living on the moon and Mars. Aurora, as you would have had fun writing this chapter, it is also totally bizarre and unrealistic. Do you want to comment further here?
This chapter was absolutely the most fun to write because, yeah, men's fantasies of getting off the earth and out of their bodies in order to live forever elsewhere are so outlandish that all you have to do to mock them is straightforwardly pitch back the men's own words. Of course, it's also very serious because the men aren't joking. They are serious. They seriously mean to do these demented things, and they have the money and the resources to do them. The wealthiest, most powerful, influential men in the world want to outfit themselves, and some of us, not most of us, some of us, with prosthetic robo-limbs and live in underground volcanic caverns eating hamburger-flavored algae on Mars. And that is a level of insanity that should terrify us. I am terrified by it. I'm also deeply saddened that men should hate the world so much. At the same time, it's hilarious. When I was reading Ray Kurzweil in The Singularity is Near, write about how the nanobots that he expects to digest our food for us might be stored inside a sort of subtle undershirt for inconspicuous daily wear, I was cracking up. I scared my cat doing so. Transhumanism is absurd. It's laughable. And without understating the threat that it poses, we really need to make fun of it as much as possible, at the very least, to do our part to take the wind out of these men's sails.
Yep, absolutely. And Aurora's beautiful summary says it all in a nutshell. Quote, such is man's awesome, inspiring genius to have the vision, insight to intuit that what mankind owes to life is to flee from it, which is such a good sentence, really. Now, the last section in this chapter is titled The Post-Biological Future of Male Domination. Aurora explains, soon the day will come. It is coming even now. Man spies its light trembling at the horizon like a new sun. The kingdom of man will then enter its next phase, the post-biological era of mankind, quote, evolve beyond flesh and blood. The evolution man envisions ends in self-divinization. Now, technologically consecrated, man rises up immortal. Or, as Ray Kurzweil says, ultimately the entire universe will become saturated with our intelligence. This is the destiny of the universe. I mean, the chutzpah that these men have, unbelievable. Aurora summarizes this brilliant chapter. Man at the height of his powers shall create his own newborn universe as the moribund old one goes guttering out. And his fresh successor will be a universe far more spectacular than the last, for it will be man's from the start. Indeed, and I want to add that no Eve will stand in man's way. Now we move into the last chapter. It's called Resurrectory Feminism, Revitalize, Reintegrate, resensitized, revolt, and it's getting better. Susan.
There was a quick question in the chat asking what Susan Griffin's book was called. It's called Woman and Nature, and it is fabulous. 1978 it was published. Okay, so it's a nice continuation in some ways, because I'm now going to mention Rachel Carson, who in 1954 wrote, "Mankind has gone very far into an artificial world of his own creation. She'd be turning over in her grave to see man's latest manifestations." The idea of bodilessness finds its apogee in postmodernism and transhumanism, and you can find it being spouted by writers like Donna Haraway as well as Martine Rothblatt, the man. Aurora also cites Laura Lecuona, who says that this philosophy converts women, quote, from being an objective material reality to something that occurs subjectively in people's minds. And the ideas of Haraway and Rothblatt contribute to the dehumanization experienced by women in the porn and prostitution industries. Aurora also writes about definitional drift, which is a wonderful term, and notes that, quote, "to say that women are female bodies is condemned as an exclusionary atrocity, an act of discursive violence against men who identify with femininity and so suppose themselves to be women. But when hyperventilated language like that can be used, how can we speak about genuine atrocities such as rape, torture, murder? It destroys our language." One of the goals of the women's liberation movement was to embrace the body. But these days, as Aurora points out, quote, "true liberation can be realized only after the body is left behind," unquote. Such is the ideology of transgenderism, a body-denying, anti-reality, anti-female system of thought. So these are delusional systems of thought. So what can we do? Aurora suggests that we could be more like animals, that is, become attuned to what is around us. She writes about the special quality humans have as a storytelling species. And she compares the way that fungal mycorrhiza is thoroughly interconnected, a mutualistic, symbiotic entanglement between the mycelium and the roots of trees and other plants. If you want to read more about that, you can look up Suzanne Simard's book, The Mother Tree, wonderful book. This strikes me as such an important analogy for the way in which humans could interact, if only. If only we could develop what Aurora calls radical empathy, to retain our capacity to care, to learn how to resensitize ourselves to the greatest extent possible. We should. First, to refuse to collaborate. Secondly, provide sanctuary to the wounded. And finally, to engage in organized political resistance. Aurora writes that women's oppression is not abstract, and also that the attacks on female bodies are not discrete misfortunes that befall us as individuals at random, but in fact large-scale social processes institutionalized for the preservation of male power by means of breaking down females en masse as a sex class, end of quote. Or as Andrea Dworkin said in 1997, fighting back is as close to healing as we're going to come. We declare our bodies, we declare our womanness, and we won't give up is the message of this book. Now, Aurora, I kept my notes on chapter 6 fairly short because clearly nature and our connection to it is important. I'd like to hear more about that and anything else you want to add about the book.
My sense is that recultivating our attention to and our intimate connections with the living natural world is the first and most necessary step that each feminist can take in order to shake herself loose of male dominion. We need to evict the patriarchal ideologies that have colonized our thinking before we can move forward. And since the fundamental stance of male dominion is this rejection of mortal material reality, this horror and hatred and denial of the bodies that we are, and this desire to transcend nature, it is these rejections and fears and denials that have to be the first to go, which means undoing dualism by reintegrating body and mind in recognition that the two are in fact one. It means accepting that we are animals, accepting the vulnerabilities and mortality of the organisms that we are. If man hates life on Earth, then feminism's counter is to love life with a vital, revitalizing love that will draw us back into reality and drive us together in resistance, defending ourselves as we defend the Earth, for there is no division. I'm always wary of sounding maudlin when I try to articulate the urgent need to love the real world, to remember and revere the sanctity of creation, because it's easy to default to cliches around this subject. At the risk of triteness, then, I'll say that for me, feminism's highest potential is the corrective that it offers to male dominion's mastermind mentality, the ideological origin of this civilization's earth-destroying violence. Feminism could save the world, and that should be our agenda. But if we're going to do it, we will have to devote ourselves to reality with an ardor that's fiercer than men's hatred for it.
Thank you, Aurora. And that is the end of our presentation. I mean, as I said at the beginning, it's absolutely fabulous, fascinating, highly intellectual book. And I just really urge you all to read it, because what we presented this evening is just a small percentage of what's in the book. It's actually quite incredible how much information and knowledge and Aurora, you managed to put into this, what is it, 350 pages. So thank you very, very much for doing this presentation, and to Susan also, and to everybody being here. And obviously this is recorded, and we can all go back and watch the video. And I also want to see what was said in the chat, because I couldn't really concentrate. So thank you to everybody. Thank you, Joe, as always, but also thank you, Dorothea, this evening, and everybody else, Sheila, who is always here and makes these seminars possible. I think they're really, really, really important for feminism as a political movement to move forward. And moving forward, we have to, because what else can we do? We have to move forward. So thank you again, Aurora, for your absolutely fabulous work, and to Susan too.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all, and goodbye.
Thanks.
Goodbye.